My name is Mariana, and at 58 years old, I never imagined I would discover that my family's entire fortune, the companies, the properties, the comfortable life I had always known, originated from a crime that happened over 60 years ago. It all started when my grandfather Antonio died at 94. He had always been the respected patriarch of the family. A man who built an empire from nothing, as he always said. Owner of a construction company that erected half the buildings in the city, proprietor of dozens of properties, a man everyone considered an example of hard work and honesty. But when the lawyer read his will 3 months ago, I discovered I knew very little about the man who raised me. And what I discovered forever changed how I see my family, my last name, and especially how I see myself. Because when you discover that your entire life was built on a lie, that every brick of the house where you grew up was paid for with dirty money, that every opportunity you had came from a crime, how do you continue living with that? This is a story that affected me in a way I still can't completely process. And if you're listening to this, it's because I decided to share the truth. Even knowing it could destroy my family's reputation forever. Before I continue, if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please take a moment to do so now. Real, impactful stories like this one are rare to hear. And in the comments, tell me where you're watching from. I love knowing that these experiences reach people in different places around the world. To understand the magnitude of what I discovered, I need to tell you what my life was like before this revelation. I grew up in a family everyone envied. My grandfather, Antonio, was respected throughout the entire city. He started as a construction worker in the 1950s and, according to him, through hard work and savings, managed to open his own construction company in the 1960s. The company grew rapidly, and soon he was building the main commercial and residential buildings in the region. I remember him always repeating, "Mariana, honest money has a different smell. You can sleep with a clear conscience when you know every cent was earned with sweat." We lived in a mansion in the city's most noble neighborhood. I studied at the best private schools, got a business administration degree from a renowned university in London, traveled to Europe at 18. I never lacked anything. My father, Carlos, followed Grandpa's footsteps and took over the construction company when he graduated in engineering. He was an upright man, respected by employees, known for always paying on time and treating everyone with dignity. The family had a tradition. Every Sunday we gathered at Grandpa Antonio's house for lunch. He sat at the head of the table, told stories about the company's early years, talked about the sacrifices he made to give his children and grandchildren a better life. "You have to be proud of our last name," he would say. The Silva family built a solid reputation in this city. Never tarnished that. I was so proud of him, so proud to carry the Silva name. When I got married, I didn't even want to change my last name. "I'm Silva by birth," I would say. I worked at the construction company for over 30 years, first in the financial department, then as administrative director. I knew every contract, every project, every employee. Or at least I thought I did. My grandfather was always very reserved about the past. When we asked about how he had gotten the initial money to open the company, he gave vague answers. "I saved penny by penny. I worked 3 shifts. My mother helped me with her savings." But there were strange details. For example, he always got nervous when they talked about the years 1958 and 1959. If someone mentioned some event from that period, he would quickly change the subject. There was also the issue of documents. When I took over the administrative part of the company, I noticed that the oldest records, from before 1960, were incomplete. "Old paper gets lost," Grandpa would say when I asked. And there were people he simply didn't like us to mention. The Andrid family, for example. Whenever someone talked about the Andrids, an influential family that had disappeared from the city in the 1960s, my grandfather was visibly uncomfortable. But I never suspected anything serious. I thought they were just the eccentricities of an elderly man, maybe some old commercial rivalry, nothing more. Grandpa Antonio's funeral was huge. It seemed like the entire city was there. Businessmen, politicians, old company employees, families that had been benefited by his generosity over the years. During the wake, several people approached to tell stories about how my grandfather had helped in difficult times. It was comforting to know he had really made a difference in so many people's lives, but there was a strange moment. An elderly gentleman, who must have been about 80, approached me and said, "Your family is going to discover the truth now. Antonio kept secrets for too long." Before I could ask what he meant, he walked away and disappeared into the crowd. I asked my father if he knew the man, but he said no. The will reading was scheduled for a week after the funeral. We were all there: my father Carlos, my mother Regina, me, my brother Paulo, my sister-in-law, and my 2 adult children, Dr. Silvera. The family lawyer for over 20 years began reading the usual provisions. The main house went to my father. The construction company would be divided between him and my uncle Paulo. The smaller properties would be distributed among the grandchildren. But then he stopped and said something that gave me chills. "There's a special clause in this will." Antonio left specific instructions for certain information to be revealed only after his death. He took a sealed envelope with my name written in Grandpa's handwriting. Mariana, read Dr. Silvera, was chosen by the testator to be the first to receive this information, due to her position of trust in the family business administration. I felt my heart race. Why me? Why not my father? The envelope contained a key and an address I didn't recognize, along with a letter: "My dear granddaughter. If you're reading this, it's because the time has come for someone in the family to know the whole truth. I carried this burden alone for over 60 years, but I can't take it to the grave without at least one person knowing who I really was. The address that accompanies this letter will take you to a storage facility I rented decades ago. There are stored documents, photographs, and evidence that explain how our family really began. I only ask that, before judging my actions, you understand the context of the time and the circumstances that led me to do what I did. I wasn't a bad man, Mariana, but I did things I'm not proud of to ensure you would have a better future. The key opens not only the storage unit, but also a safe inside it. The combination is the date of my marriage to your grandmother, the 6th of December, 1952. After you know everything, it will be up to you to decide what to do with this information. I trust your judgment and discretion. With all my love and my request for forgiveness, Grandpa Antonio. My hands trembled as I held the letter. My family looked at me expectantly, but I couldn't articulate a word. Before continuing to tell what I discovered in that storage facility, and you can't imagine the magnitude of what was stored there, I need to take a break. If you're finding this story impactful, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Real stories like this, involving family secrets kept for decades, are rare to hear, and we need your support to keep bringing this content. In the comments, tell me, where are you watching from? I want to know if this story is reaching you in New York, Los Angeles, London, Toronto, or anywhere else in the world. Now, let's discover together what my grandfather had hidden for over 60 years. I couldn't sleep that night. Grandpa's letter kept spinning in my head along with 1,000 questions. What could he have done that was so serious? Why did he choose to tell me and not my father? The next day, I made an excuse to the family and went alone to the indicated address. It was in an old industrial zone of the city, in a warehouse that seemed abandoned for years. The key easily opened the metal door. Inside, there was a small space, but neatly organized. Some shelves with numbered boxes, an old table, and in the corner, an old safe that seemed to have seen better decades. I started with the boxes. The first contained old photographs from the 1950s and 1960s. I recognized my young grandfather, but there were many people I didn't know, and there was something strange. In several photos, large amounts of money appeared in bundles, as if they were records of important transactions. The second box contained newspaper clippings, all from the same period, 1958. 1959. The headlines talked about a major bank robbery in the region, a crime that had shaken the city at the time. Gang robs $500,000 from regional bank, said one. Police search for clues to the city's biggest heist in history, said another. My heart started beating faster. Why would my grandfather keep clippings about a robbery? In the third box, I found maps. Detailed floor plans of the regional bank, with handwritten annotations. Escape routes marked in red, operating hours noted. It was a meticulous and detailed plan. But it was in the fourth box that I found what confirmed my worst fears. Photographs of the bank's interior, clearly taken clandestinely. And in one of them, in the corner of the image, my grandfather appeared wearing a beret, observing the employees' movement. I felt nauseous. My grandfather, the upright man I had always admired, had participated in the most famous robbery in our city's history. But that was just the beginning. I opened the safe with the wedding date combination. Inside there was a thick folder and several small jewelry boxes. The folder contained what appeared to be a complete confession, handwritten by Grandpa himself. I began reading with trembling hands. My real story began in 1958. I was 28 years old, had been married to Rosa for 6 years, and worked as a construction worker earning very little. Rosa was pregnant with our first child, who would be Carlos, and we could barely afford the rent for a small room in a boarding house. That's when I met Edmundo Endred. Edmundo was the son of a wealthy family that had lost everything in an investment crisis. He was desperate, in debt, and had a proposal. He knew all the operational details of the regional bank because his father had been one of the founding partners years before. The proposal was simple: a clean robbery, without violence, on a Friday afternoon when traffic would be lighter. Edmundo had the inside information. I had the physical strength and courage. We would split 50. At first, I refused. I wasn't a thief. But when Rosa started feeling sick during pregnancy, and we needed money for a doctor, when I saw that my salary wouldn't even cover the medications she needed, Edmundo's proposal began to seem like the only way out. I stopped reading, my heart racing. My grandfather had committed the robbery out of necessity to care for his family. But that didn't justify the crime, did it? I continued reading. We spent 3 months planning everything. Edmundo got bank blueprints, operating schedules, information about the security system. I studied the escape routes, blind spots, the best times. On September 13, 1958, on a rainy Friday, we executed the plan. Everything went as planned. We entered the bank 5 minutes before closing, held up the 2 employees who stayed until later, opened the main vault and took all the money we could carry. It was $500,000, a fortune at the time. The equivalent of several years of work for a construction worker like me. But then the story took a turn. I didn't expect. 3 days after the robbery, Edmundo showed up at my house in panic. He said the police were investigating and he was sure they would discover our participation. He wanted to flee the city immediately. I said I couldn't leave Rosa alone, pregnant. That's when Edmundo made me a proposal that would change everything. He would flee alone, taking only a small part of the money to establish himself in another city. The rest would stay with me, but I would have to take all responsibility if we were discovered. If they catch us, he said, you say you did everything alone. In exchange, you keep almost all the money and can give your family a decent life. I accepted. Edmundo disappeared from the city that same day and no one ever heard from him again. Folks, I had to stop reading for a few minutes to process what I was discovering. Imagine how it must have been for me to discover that my grandfather was not only a criminal, but that our entire family fortune came from this robbery. If you're as shocked as I was, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. And in the comments, tell me, have you ever discovered a family secret that completely changed your view of someone you loved? Where are you watching this story from? New York, Chicago, Miami, London, Sydney, or perhaps from other countries. Now, I'll tell you what happened to Edmundo Andrade and why our family never heard about the Andrades again. I continued reading the confession with trembling hands. Edmundo disappeared, as promised. But 3 months later, I received a letter from him. He was in a small town in upstate New York, had changed his name, was trying to start his life over. In the letter, he said he regretted having abandoned his family here. His parents, who knew nothing about the robbery, were desperate looking for him. His mother was getting sick with worry. Edmundo asked me to give news to the family, but without revealing where he was. He said when things calmed down, he would return. But things never calmed down. The police continued investigating. And worse, they began to suspect the Andrade family. They didn't know about Edmundo's participation, but they knew someone with inside knowledge had participated in the robbery. That's when I committed my second mistake, perhaps worse than the robbery itself. A police detective, named Ribeiro, sought me out. He said he knew I had information about the case. He offered a proposal. If I helped the investigation, indicating possible suspects, he would protect me from any suspicion. I turned in the Andrade family. I told the detective I had heard rumors that old Andrade was having financial problems, that Edmundo had been asking questions about the bank, that the family seemed desperate. Within 2 weeks, the police arrested Edmundo's father and younger brother. They were tortured to confess to a crime they didn't commit. The father died in prison 3 months later. The brother was released for lack of evidence, but was completely destroyed. Edmundo's mother went insane with grief. She lost her husband. One son was missing, the other was traumatized. She died a year later of heartbreak, and I used the stolen money to buy my first plot of land and start building our house. I also opened the construction company, hired the first employees. Everything with dirty money, money that cost the destruction of an innocent family. I had to stop reading. I was shaking, nauseous. My grandfather had not only stolen, he had betrayed his partner and destroyed an entire family to protect himself. But the confession continued. Edmundo never knew what happened to his family. He continued sending me letters sporadically over the years, always asking for news about his parents, always saying he would return when he could. The last letter I received from him was in 1987. He said he was sick, that he really wanted to see his family once more before dying. He asked me to give his parents his address. I never answered that letter. I couldn't tell him his parents were dead, that his brother had become an alcoholic and lived on the streets. I couldn't tell him it was all my fault. Edmundo died in 1989, according to what I discovered years later through an obituary I found by chance in a newspaper from upstate. He died alone, away from his family, believing that someday he could return home. And I built an empire on this lie. Every building I erected, every contract I signed, every employee I hired, everything started with that stolen money and the destruction of the Andrade family. In the small boxes inside the safe, I found the jewelry that had been stolen along with the money. Rings, necklaces, earrings, pieces I recognized from old photos of the Andrade family I had seen in city albums. My grandfather had kept everything. Not just the money, but even the jewelry that belonged to the indirect victims of his crime. There was also a list, with names and addresses updated over the years. It was a list of the Andrade family descendants who still lived in the region. Edmundo's younger brother, João Andrade, who had been unjustly imprisoned, was still alive. At 78, he lived in a simple house on the other side of town. He had children and grandchildren I didn't even know existed. My grandfather had secretly followed this family's life for decades. He knew where they lived, where they worked, how they were doing financially, and they all lived with difficulties, while we prospered with money that should have been used to rebuild their lives. Folks, can you imagine how I felt discovering that our prosperity came from another family's misfortune? That while we lived in a mansion, the rightful owners of that fortune lived in poverty? If this story is affecting you as much as it affected me, leave a like and keep following the channel. And tell me in the comments, how would you act in a situation like this? Where are you watching from? Because now comes the hardest part. What to do with this information, ... I spent 3 days locked at home, unable to look my family in the eyes, pretending I had the flu. How could I tell my father that the empire he administered with such pride had started with a robbery? How could I tell him that our family reputation was all based on a lie? That there was something that bothered me even more. The d'Andrade family, João Andrade, Edmundo's brother who had been unjustly imprisoned, was still alive. His children and grandchildren had grown up without knowing the truth about what happened to their family. I decided to look for João Andrade. I found his house on a Thursday afternoon. It was a simple 2-story house on a lower middle-class street, very different from our mansion in the city center. When I rang the doorbell, a white-haired gentleman opened the door. His eyes were deep, carrying a sadness that seemed old. I recognized in him the features I had seen in the family's old photos. "Mr. João Andrade?" I asked. He confirmed with suspicion. "My name is Mariana Silva. I would like to talk with you about your family, about what happened in the 1950s. His expression changed completely. He went pale. His hands started trembling. "Are you from the police?" he asked. "No. I'm the granddaughter of Antonio Silva." He looked at me with a mixture of confusion and anger. "Silva? That name, ... he murmured. "Why would a Silva want to talk to me about my family?" "Because I discovered things you need to know. Things about your brother Edmundo? About what really happened to him?" João invited me in. The house was modest, but clean and organized. On the walls, there were family photos, and I recognized some people from the photographs I had found in the storage facility. "Edmundo disappeared in 1958, said João, his voice choked. "One day he was here, the next he had vanished. My father died believing Edmundo had fled out of shame for something he had done. My mother went crazy looking for him." I took a deep breath and began telling the whole truth. The robbery, the partnership with my grandfather, the escape, the letters Edmundo sent over the years, his death alone in the countryside. João cried. He cried like a child. After over 60 years, he finally knew what had happened to his brother. "He didn't abandon us," he repeated. "He didn't abandon us." But when I told him about how my grandfather had turned in the family to the police, when I explained that their father's arrest and the torture João suffered had been caused by my grandfather's betrayal, sadness turned into anger. "Your family built a fortune on our misfortune," he said, his voice trembling. "While you lived like kings, we lost everything. My father died in jail. My mother died of grief. I lost 15 years of my life trying to recover from the trauma of prison." There was nothing to answer. He was right. That's when I did something I hadn't even planned. I offered reparation. "Mr. João, I know I can't undo what happened, but I can try to fix, at least partially, the damage my family caused." I explained that I had access to the family's assets, that I could transfer a significant amount to him and his descendants. Not as charity, but as restitution for what had been stolen from them. João looked at me in silence for several minutes. "Why are you doing this?" he finally asked. "Because I can no longer live knowing our prosperity cost your family's destruction. Because I want my children to inherit clean assets, not built on crime and betrayal." In the following days, I talked to my children separately. I told them the whole truth, showed them the documents, explained my decision to make reparations to the Andrade family. My eldest son, Andre, was outraged at first. "Mom, that was over 60 years ago. We weren't the ones who did this." But my daughter, Carla, understood immediately. "Mom, you're doing the right thing. We can't build our future on other people's suffering. The most difficult reaction was my father's. When I told my father Carlos everything, he was in shock for hours. He couldn't accept that the man he had admired his whole life, whom he had always cited as an example of integrity, was a criminal. "This can't be true," he repeated. "Dad wasn't capable of this." I showed him all the documents, the confession written in Grandpa's own hand, the photos, the newspaper clippings. There was no way to deny it. My father went through all the stages of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression. It was a painful process for the whole family. But the worst was yet to come. When I announced my decision to transfer a significant part of the family patrimony to the Andrades, my father and brother revolted. "You're going to break the company?" shouted my brother Paulo. "You're going to destroy decades of honest work." "Honest work built on dirty money," I replied. The family split. My father and brother thought I was being extremist, that we shouldn't take responsibility for Grandpa's crimes. My children supported me, but with reservations about the amount I intended to transfer. I consulted lawyers, accountants, psychologists. Everyone advised caution. "Mrs. Mariana, this could generate lawsuits," said one. "It could bankrupt your company," warned another. But there was something stronger than all this practical advice: my conscience. For weeks, I couldn't sleep. Every time I looked at our house, our cars, our possessions, I saw Joe Andrade's suffering face. I saw the family that had been destroyed so ours could prosper. I made a radical decision. I would transfer 40% of the family patrimony to the Andrade family descendants. It would be enough to give them a decent life, but still leave enough for our family to continue well. It wasn't easy to execute this decision. I had to sell some properties, reorganize the business, convince partners and investors. My father didn't speak to me for months. My brother tried to sue me to prevent the transfer, but on the day I signed the deed transferring a house and a sum of money to João Andrade, I felt a peace I hadn't felt in months. João cried when he received the keys. For the first time in 60 years, he said, "I feel like my father can rest in peace." João's children and grandchildren were initially suspicious. Why was a wealthy family giving them money? But when I explained the whole story, when I showed it wasn't charity, but justice, they understood. João's daughter, Conceição, told me something I'll never forget. "Mrs. Marion, you can't change the past, but you can teach your children that doing the right thing is worth more than keeping up appearances." Today, 6 months after all this, I can say it was the most difficult and most correct decision I've ever made in my life. Our company still exists, is still prosperous, but now I know it's built on a clean foundation. The money circulating there comes from honest work from recent decades, not from my grandfather's crime. Joe Andrade died 2 months ago, at 78, but he died knowing the truth about his brother, knowing the family had been restored, knowing the injustice had been at least partially repaired. At his funeral, I met dozens of Andrade family descendants. Hardworking, honest people who had grown up hearing stories about the brother who abandoned the family and the grandfather who died unjustly in prison. Now they know the truth, and more importantly, they know someone cared enough to do justice, even decades later. My relationship with my father recovered gradually. He still has difficulty completely accepting what Grandpa did, but he understood why I needed to act. "You did what I didn't have the courage to do," he told me recently. My brother Paulo still hasn't completely forgiven me, but we started talking again. The family is healing, slowly, and I sleep peacefully for the first time in months. When I look in the mirror, I no longer see a criminal's granddaughter. I see a woman who had the courage to face the truth and do what was right. Conceição Andrade, João's daughter, became a dear friend. Our children met. Our families grew closer. It's strange to think it took a 60-year-old crime to unite two families that should have been friends from the beginning. The construction company continues operating, but now with even stricter transparency and social responsibility policies. We created a fund to help vulnerable families in the city. It's our way of giving back to the community that always supported us. Some businessmen in the city criticized me for the decision. "You created a dangerous precedent," some said. "What if everyone starts investigating rich families' pasts?" My answer is always the same. If everyone does the right thing, our city will be a better place. I learned that carrying family secrets is a terrible burden. My grandfather carried this guilt alone for over 60 years. He died without ever finding peace. I chose a different path. I chose transparency, even knowing it would cost dearly. And I can say it was the best decision of my life. Today, when my grandchildren ask me about the family's history, I tell them the whole truth. I tell them about the great-grandfather's mistakes, but also about how we tried to fix them. I tell them a family isn't defined by past mistakes, but by how it chooses to deal with them. My eldest grandson, 12 years old, told me something that moved me. "Grandma, you taught me that doing the right thing is more important than being rich." That's exactly what I wanted them to learn. The truth sets you free, folks. It may hurt at first, it may cost dearly, it may temporarily divide families. But in the end, it always sets you free. Today, I know our current fortune comes from honest work. I know I can look anyone in our city in the eyes without feeling shame. I know my children and grandchildren will inherit not only material goods, but also integrity and courage to do what's right. And that, for me, is worth more than all the millions my grandfather stole. Folks, if you made it to the end of this story, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart. Sharing this wasn't easy, but I felt I needed to tell you that sometimes the right thing isn't the easy thing. If this story touched you in any way, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Share it with people you think need to hear this message about courage, about doing the right thing even when it costs dearly. And in the comments, tell me, have you ever had to make a difficult decision between doing what was easy and doing what was right? How was it? Where are you watching from? I want to know if this story of redemption and courage reached you, wherever you are in the world. And always remember, a family isn't defined by past mistakes, but by how it chooses to deal with them. Doing the right thing is always worth more than keeping up appearances. Until the next story, and may you have the courage to always choose truth, even when it hurts.